Hello, I'm Ron Kettleson, and I'm president of the Sharon Historical Society. We're excited to have you here tonight and also very thrilled to have Sharon Aitchison, who will be presenting her presentation on the secret story of quilts and the Underground Railroad. Sharon has presented for us several times, and her presentations are some of the top watched videos on our YouTube channel. So we're really excited that Sharon is joining us once again. And Sharon, take it away.
Thank you, Ron. I have long been interested in the Underground Railroad, and when I was asked to do this, it piqued my curiosity even further, and I enjoyed the research and the investigation very much. I thought I knew quite a bit about the Underground Railroad, but it turns out I was wrong. After reading The Secret to Freedom by Marcia Vaughn and The Underground Railroad by Kate Messner and Wendell Hanks, I realized how much more in depth I needed to search to understand this secret network of people who offered assistance to slaves who were escaping to freedom and the meaning of the secret codes contained in their quilt patterns. After the American Revolution, more enslaved decided to take liberty and freedom quite seriously. Some claimed their freedom through uprisings, but many planned quiet, secret escapes. The northern states were making slavery illegal, so southern slaves began to escape northward rather than hiding in forests, swamps, or cities. There was help along the escape routes, including shelter. The Underground Railroad was much more than secret paths of safe housing. There were hidden, secret places along the path. History has taught us that slaves in the Deep South had to pass through states where slavery was still accepted, while slaves in states that bordered where slavery had become illegal could find freed blacks and willing white helpers. Who were those helpers? A Christian group who came to America late in the 1600s were the Quakers. They were known as the good white people. Many were anti slavery and helped those seeking freedom, speaking up about slavery being anti Christian and a national evil. After the Union won the Civil War, some Quakers and white abolitionists began to publish their accounts of participating in helping the freedom seekers. Some stories may be a bit embellished and thus became some of the lore and legends of the Underground Railroad. Black sailors and dock workers would sneak people on ships in southern ports. They also brought information to the enslaved with news of laws and opinions in the North, which captains might also be willing to help. The seamen carried letters between the enslaved and their families and their friends in the North. As the freedom seekers arrived north, they might meet abolitionists who offered them food, money, shelter, train tickets, and clothing. Those Northerners who knew the laws might defend the freedom seekers in the courts. For all of the tales of the Underground Railroad, historical documents say otherwise. Freedom seekers generally had to figure out their escape all on their own. If they got any help at all, it was likely once they reached the North. Their sheer grit, bravery, and desperation drove them to arrive to the North. There are sadly many stories of escape and the Underground Railroad are completely lost as they were never written down or told. Keeping records would have severely put escapees and anyone assisting them at tremendous risk. One of the most famous Underground Railroad stories is that of Henry Box Brown. He worked in a tobacco factory and longed for freedom, praying for a way. The notion once came to him that if he could shut himself in a box and get conveyed to a free state, he'd be aided by a black friend and white man who helped him conceal himself in the box. They gave him water and biscuits, and they drilled holes made for air. After more than 26 hours traveling in a wagon, boat, and train to Philadelphia, William Still and other anti slavery activists were waiting. They had a saw and a hatchet and opened the box to free Henry. This signals lanterns and how they play a part in the freedom quilts. Legend says that the enslaved could distinguish safe places by lanterns in windows or a quilt with coating hung from a clothesline. A well known activist, John Rankin, who lived on the Ohio River, it's said that he would signal safe crossing by a lit lantern. However, it is also believed that lanterns were not widely used, as safe houses would have been easily discovered by the slave hunters. Oral stories are a very important part of historical record keeping, especially as they relate to African American families. Remember that slaves were forbidden to learn to or to be taught to read and write. Thus, oral history is valuable. Without reading and writing, their family history could otherwise be unknown, save for the spoken. Is this so very different from our own family histories? We have photos and written information if we are lucky. We have ships' manifests and other historical documents that can be found with research and study of our own genealogy. I remember when I found the ship's manifest of my dad's crossing to the United States. He came here from Germany in about 1930 as a 7-year-old. It was so exciting to see his name and my grandparents written right there in that old script. And I still have a copy of it, of course. Historical documents can be found with research and study of our genealogy. However, none of that was available to the enslaved, and even if it were, it was unlikely they would be able to even read it. Their stories passed through their generations, grandmother to daughter, daughter to granddaughter, and on down the line. They're all they had and all that most of us have. The written history as we receive it is ours to believe or to question. I personally feel trust in a story told from the heart and mind of one who lived it, whether embellished or not over years of retelling, until someone could and would write it down. What about the Underground Railroad quilts? Stories say that the quilts of the Underground Railroad were filled with symbols. With the background we've just discussed, let's turn our attention to the spoken tales and those who were able to record them. In my reading of the book Hidden in Plain View, I share excerpts and offer some discussion. I highly recommend this book as a read. It's full of documentations and interesting facts. The stories of Ozella Williams were passed down through the generations, grandmother to mother, mother to daughter, daughter to granddaughter. In 1993, remembering that's just 20 years ago, author Jacqueline Tobin visited the Old Market Building in Charleston, South Carolina. That's where local craftspeople sell their wares. And I might add it's on my bucket list of places to visit. There, Tobin met Ozella Williams, an African American quilter, and she struck up conversation. Ozella told the fascinating story handed down from her mother and grandmother, explaining the coded quilts and how they were used to navigate their escape via the Underground Railroad. It took 3 years for the author to hear all of the story. Whichever version you choose to believe will be fun and interesting for discussion. Tobin's acknowledgments state that when Ozella first told me to write this down, little did I know that she was introducing me to keeping African American history alive. Many contributions to her book, ranging from historians who shared their research and others who described African retentions and personal memories, stitched into their quilts and fabric art, are a sort of a photo sent in slave-made quilts. It became assumed then that Underground Railroad signals to slaves were only orally transmitted and lacked corroboration in written form. It was felt that it lacked credibility. Remembering it was in some states unlawful to teach slaves to read and write. Anything in a form other than spoken would be nearly impossible. An amazing example of oral traditions is the quilt code of the Underground Railroad. This was a mysterious secret system of using quilting terminology as a message map for slaves escaping with the Underground Railroad. This system is told to authors Tobin and Dobbard by Ozella. They learned the work and phrases of the code used over 150 years ago to communicate to the escaping slaves. The traditions of encoding signs in textile design, usually by the women, came with Africans to the New World. Jacqueline Tobin shares her visit in Charleston, South Carolina, and she wanted to learn more about sweetgrass baskets and hear the stories of African American women who created them. The unique culture of the blended American and African American people in Charleston, the location where Black slaves were the first set their feet on American soil. On a walk through the old marketplace, Tobin found African American women, many of whom are direct descendants of slaves. They were weaving baskets just like their ancestors did 100+ years prior. She then found herself in the stall of quilts of every size, shape, color, and pattern. As she looked around, an elderly African American woman in bright geometric attire approached her and motioned her to sit. She opened a quilt and she said, "Did you know that quilts were used by slaves to communicate on the Underground Railroad?" Tobin was quite surprised, and she says in her book, "Why was she even telling me, a complete stranger, this story?" So Tobin purchased a quilt, went back home, hung it up, and set her memories aside. Several months later, she found the old woman's flyer again and remembered the story that Ozella had shared. It got her wondering if there was perhaps more to the story, so she phoned Ozella. Tobin asked her if she would share more of her story, and then came a curt response from Ozella, telling her that she couldn't speak with her at that time. She said, "Don't worry, you'll get the story when you're ready, and you could call the next day." And then she just hung up. With her curiosity piqued even more, Tobin traveled from St. Louis to New Orleans, stopping along the way to visit quilters and scholars, plantations, slave quarters, and searching for more clues. None of her encounters led her to anyone who was sure about the Underground Railroad. Most had heard of quilts being used for secret communication, but no one was certain how. She found no slave quilts for verification. It was largely believed most quilts would never have survived all of the use. They were constructed from inferior fabrics and were likely the best they could have found to construct quilts with, and having been washed often in harsh soaps, probably containing lye, they would surely have fallen to bits. Tobin tells that she then became hesitant to continue. Some people were reluctant to share their precious family stories, and especially with a white woman. But she carried on. 3 years later, as she finished her research, she still felt there was a missing link. She needed connection of quilts to the Underground Railroad. Her intuition told her that Ozella still knew more than she had shared. So back to the Charleston marketplace she went again. At that time, Ozella sat her down, pointed to Tobin's notepad, and said, "Write this down." Ozella spoke for 3 straight hours. No one approached them. Ozella stopped only to ask Tobin to repeat back to her what she had just written down, and they were surrounded by Ozella's quilts. The story had only been verbalized and passed through generations. Tobin was the first to write it down. A story of truth, survival, and memory. Ozella's story was shared with Tobin on May 11, 1996. Tobin named it the Underground Quilt Codes. They agreed that substantiating the story and the codes may not be proven, but instead presented for consideration. This piqued Tobin and Dobert's curiosity even more. Was there an association to African Americans? They soon discovered narratives of African American quilter Harriet Powers and her rendering of Jacob's Ladder and references to Masmus symbols. While researching Power's quilt images, Tobin and Dabbard wondered, was she an Eastern Star member? Then that led them to learn about the Prince Hall Masons of an African American fraternal order compared to African secret societies in their community roles. They also used geometric motifs as symbols and signs. Was there a real connection between the Prince Hall Masons, the Underground Railroad, Ozella's story and codes, and stories told by the excuse me, told by the Prince Hall Masons? Abstract and improvised designs, strip piecing, bold colors, more than just geometry, is found in African American quilts. How could these encode a message when they seem like confusions? Herbs were placed within the quilt batting to ward off illness and give healing powers. Certain colors and combinations of colors were considered potent. Ozella told Tobin that slaves were able to communicate through colors, bright or subdued, non complementary, abstract, geometric. Did they each contain a message? And what about the actual stitches? Ozella claimed they were a visual language. She believed the fine, delicate, nearly invisible stitches were not the ones of language. Plain quilts, the everyday utilized quilts, they were quilted with heavy threads or hemp and large, uneven stitches. Thick surface knots were likely the African American quilts. These generally had bulky centers and were easily explained as rustic, given they were constructed using old clothes and ratty blankets, therefore quite difficult to take delicate and even stitches. Perhaps this created the perfect disguise for clues, hints, and hidden messages. While tracing the evolution of the African American quilt, Tobin discussed spinning of fibers of the secret societies, secret systems of writing, talking drums, and coded textiles, and to the African American quilt itself and binding it together. The tying and knotting and the blessings of their ancestors. Sadly, Miss Ozella died on May 17th, 1998, and with her she took her stories, but fortunately, before she passed, she shared them to be put in writing. Q.S. de Benberry, a pioneer in the field of quilt scholarship, shares that in the years after the Civil War ended, orally transmitted information of secret codes, camouflage symbols, and disguised signs have been discovered and were part of the Underground Railroad. Oral accounts of escaping on foot, traveling through unfamiliar areas, and the found homes of strangers for sanctuary through prearranged signals have been discovered. One such story, the small wooden coachman painted black, used as a hitching post and yard decoration. It also was a signpost for slaves. If it was lit, the escapees were aware they'd reach safety at this home. If unlit, it was understood to just journey on. Mrs. Elizabeth Telford Scott grew up in Chester, South Carolina. She's over 80-year-old quilter, and along with her daughter Joyce, explained how stitches in a quilt could serve as a map. Mrs. Scott's quilts often contained rocks, beads, and amulets sewn into the quilt top. This is an example of her work. It's quite intricate and actually quite spellbinding with all of its twists and turns and stitches. She continued an African tradition in her quilt creations. Her objects activate memory. She is the granddaughter of a slave. Slave quilts tell stories, according to Mrs. Scott. The style of stitching would differ from each family to family, determined by their family's place of origin and passing a distinctive style onto the next generation. And what about the patterns that we know of and their meanings? A bow tie block suggests that the slaves should try to dress as if they were wealthy. On a side note, this particular block is a very simple one to make, so it would probably be used often in a quilt. The bear's paw, there you go, directed slaves to head north over the Appalachian Mountains and to follow literal footprints of the bear, as bears go to berries, water, and other natural food sources. The log cabin quilt signaled a safe house and shelter. If you look, this is just a sketch of one, but if it was put into fabric, the left side, if you're looking at it from a diagonal, left side would be light colors. The bottom right side, that half diagonally, would be dark colors. So you see the day and night. And the very center block would be red because the fire was the center of the home, thus the red block in the middle. Slaves were aware that this meant a friend and also to set up home in a free state. The flying geese pattern clued travelers to listen for geese and follow them northward. The variations of the direction of the flying geese were sewn in a quilt and gave clues on directions, timing, and behavior of the migrating geese. The story of the Jacob's Ladder quilt has given great controversy among historians. If a Jacob's Ladder quilt was hung outside on an Underground Railroad supporter's home, a slave had reached safe haven. Other historians argue that the Jacob's Ladder pattern hadn't even been created and therefore could never have sent any secret message recognizable to the Underground Railroad fugitives. The North Star pattern is means to travel northward following the North Star. A crossroad pattern appears to have referred to Cleveland, Ohio, which was the city of hope, as it sat at the crossroads of multiple freedom paths. The carpenter's wheel is a variation on the wagon wheel block. It meant to steal away and run with faith to the West and Northwest territories. There is little known about the shoe fly pattern and its meaning. It is felt it may well have been an actual person's nickname. The drunkard's path shows a zigzag design, and so it would be your path to keep authorities from following you. The monkey wrench pattern meant to gather your tools and be prepared to escape the plantation. It's another variation of the wagon wheel pattern whose code meant to pack for a long trip, and is also known as a churn dash. That's another common name for it. The tumbling block pattern was displayed when conditions were right. Pick up and go. Blocks associated with farming are the barn raising pattern, straight furrows, and a streak of lightning, clues of places where farming existed and work may be available. It's also believed that the type of stitches in a quilt were indicators. Those fine hand stitches, again, would not likely have been used in freedom quilts. One account is of an old quilt stitched like she used a crowbar instead of a needle. The stitches, it turns out, were actually mapped. Those wide, heavy stitches indicated a route. We've learned how geometric patterns, ties, knots, stitches, and colors worked together in early slave quilts and conveyed messages to the escapees. That secrecy is no longer invisibly stitched in quilts. It is now a celebration and an ownership. Each modern quilter has so many choices in fabrics, threads, techniques, tools, often with just a particular pattern in mind. Yet we still embrace those old quilt patterns and incorporate them in many ways when creating our own modern quilts. Quilters of today have been moved and inspired by these legends, creating beautiful quilts, honoring the enslaved and those who aided in their success to freedom. In African American communities, history continues to surface as the elders crack the silence of decades and reveal the past. They no longer need to fear punishment or ridicule. Now it can be told. Tonight's presentation is just a small part of the Underground Railroad stories and quilts with hidden clues. There are those who disregard the quilt codes, finding it nothing but folly. Many other people find credible evidence to make sense of the stories of quilts, expressing codes and messages. Whichever you aspire to, the lore of the secret codes of the Underground Railroad and quilts is extremely interesting and it bears thought. It's a valuable lesson in American history. Our American heritage is valued. It's important to listen to it, to be respectful of the stories from our elders and ancestors. Ask the questions that you seek answers to. Speak to your people. Speak to them while they're still with us. Ask those questions. I have learned much new information about the Underground Railroad. I find it absolutely amazing and quite brilliant how those people have survived, how they network, their creativity and ability to code messages secretly with quilt patterns. Perhaps the real historians and researchers, the scientists and great minds, will unravel more valuable facts and lore about the Underground Railroad. My sincere thanks to the Sharon Springs Historical Society for inviting me to present tonight, and a very special thank you to all of you who joined us in for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. As I said, if you have any questions, if you go up to the chat, you can type them in there, and Sharon will try to answer those. Shelley thought it was very interesting. She had no idea that quilts were used as codes. And Carrie said, being a Canadian and near the 49th parallel, I knew a lot about this. That's great. What was one of the most interesting things that you learned, Sharon, when you were doing your research on this that you didn't know?
Holy cow, there was a lot. Um, I dug deep. As Ron saw my first narrative, I had pages and pages of research I'd done about slaves getting here in the beginning. I learned a great deal more than I had ever known before. And one of the things that I learned was as slaves came to the New World, they brought with them not just their culture and their language and their stories, they brought with them more people who were also from Africa, but just not the same language. So they had to learn all that again. They had to learn to communicate, communicating that way. And they didn't speak the same language, yet they were all thrown together in one place or many one places. Another thing of great value is that, we forget that the slaves were not allowed to read and write. And therefore, everything we have to go on from that time is simply oral history and drawings and artwork and interpretation of all that. And again, things were probably embellished over the years or perhaps misinterpreted from what their original intent was. But I really think that the research is spot on. It wouldn't, for me, it's not easily explained away.
Just a quick question about the book that you had mentioned early on. I think it was Hidden in Plain View.
Yep.
And who was that written by? You know?
That was written by Jacqueline Tobin and Dr. Daubert. I think I have it here. I'll lift it up so you can see what it looks like. I got it from a used bookshop online. Oh, it's too shiny. You probably can't see it. I got it from, I think it was Abe's Books. It's an online used bookshop. It was in great shape, and I got it for like $4, and I had $400 worth of enjoyment out of reading it. I see Sue Spivak asking, are there any slave quilts created by slaves here in Schoharie known to exist? Not that I know of, so I've seen a lot of the quilts in the old stone forts collection, and none of them were slave quilts. So if there's any in Schoharie, I don't know. Schoharie County, I don't know about it. But I will tell you there is a Underground Railroad house in Albany, New York, and it's, I believe, 174 Livingston Avenue. And you can go there and you can go through it. It's like a museum, it's been restored and saved. So that's also on my list of things to go see. And it's right here, 40 minutes away. Quilting bees are groups of women quilting together with the purpose of creating quilts. There's loads of evidence of that. Um, Both, it was something that the plantation owners and, well, other farmers also, smaller farms, did because the women didn't have many opportunities to socialize. And from my research for other presentations I've done, the stack was the children underneath the quilt frame. They earned their spot there, the little girls. And when the quilter passed the needle down through the quilt, because the needle goes straight down when you're hand quilting, the little child would pull it from behind and poke it back up. So it was a learning experience as well as helpful, because a lot of times these frames were huge. She'd poke it back up through, and the quilter on top would pull it up and then take her straight stitch back down. So the little child learned about quilting, but more than that, they learned all the gossip that went on around the quilting frame. And I've read lots of stories of kids' accounts of that. Um, I'm going to say that the slaves also did that to an extent. I don't have any documentation I can quote on that, but I would think so because their social lives were basically non-existent. So that was probably something I would think they did secretively and quietly.
Let's see. Can you see Christine Woodall's comment? Sharon?
Pardon me?
Oh, can you see Christine Woodall's comment?
Let me see. I'm not seeing it. Oh, here we go. In making the underground. Yes. That's a very good one, Christine. The Eleanor Burns Underground Railroad sampler is very good. And those that in the slides that you saw, I would say that's probably where she got her plan to create her sampler from, are those old known blocks. I'm sure there's loads of other blocks that were used that we aren't aware of, and we use them today. And remembering that this is part of what's amazing for me. I have acrylic rulers, I have rotary cutting, I have beautiful, expensive, sharp, I'll murder you if you cut paper with them, scissors. I have probably 6 sewing machines of all different, some men have 195 wrenches or screwdrivers. I have just 6 sewing machines. But when I sit down to sew, I can't help but be mindful so many times that I have all these fabulous tools. And then I think about those before us with quilting. If they were lucky, they had a pair of scissors that were probably as dull as a hoe. If they were lucky, they had a needle, or they had a fishbone or something that they used for a needle. They didn't have any of these fabulous threads that we have now that are so thin you can hardly see them, and you can take these glorious stitches. And yet they were so creative. When I look at these pictures of these old quilts, even if they are threadbare, you see that grit of taking any old thing that they could get their hands on and turn it into creativity. They made a quilt, and surely before the Underground Railroad, before slaves chose to escape, they had to stay warm. They had to have something to sleep on other than the dirt. So they've been making quilts forever, and their ancestors who came here from Africa taught them. And then, just like us, if our grandmother was a quilter and taught us, And around those quilts, as the ladies spoke, that's what we're hearing tonight. Excuse me. It wasn't written down. It was just drilled in their memory. And I'm sure they repeated the same stories over and over again. And that's how we get what we have. I have a lot of faith in this information.
You said something I thought was very interesting, and it was oftentimes they use quilts and sewed in herbs for medicinal purposes, uh,
Mhm.
which is, I don't know that we do a lot of that today, but it was an interesting way to help
And
prevent.
I think it also, some of the things they used warded off insects and bugs and stuff like that. Those natural healing things. There are some people who do use, I know lavender and lemon balm are common ones that people use when they're making quilted. I don't know anybody who does it in quilts, but I know people who do it in quilted, uh, like what you would put a casserole dish in, something like that. And, or you'd put buns or rolls in. And when the warmth hits it, that aroma permeates. I don't know anybody who's done it in a quilt, but they probably have.
Can you elaborate a little bit about, you'd mentioned about the colors of quilts were significant. How so, and can you talk more about that?
Can you repeat that, Ron? I didn't catch it.
I said you had mentioned that the colors of the quilts were significant, and can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think part of the significance, first of all, is getting their hands on colorful fabrics. Um, I think that probably started to come later on. Now, from my research, the dyes and things they use in the African nations were already there, but I don't think we had them here at that time. I don't know, but I don't think so. Not like you see in those old African ones. The other thing is, if they could create them, they created the colors from roots, trees, plants, all that sort of stuff. It wouldn't be color fast. So every time you washed it, they probably bled together or um, at least ran into one another. So having those colorful quilts to be lasting would probably be pretty miraculous. I would say it. I mean, even if you went into a museum where they have some on display, um, it may be difficult to find one still with all those vibrant colors. The old stone fort quilts are fabulous. They are gorgeous, but they're heavily preserved. They're all wrapped in tissue paper and only handled with white gloves. Nobody touches them with their bare hands, things like that, and they have survived time. But I don't believe any of those are slave quilts. Like I said, I believe they're all colonial quilts from the colonists. Um, but vibrant colors, I would think they would really stand out almost like a sore thumb because it would be hard to find fabrics. Now, perhaps they had the ladies of the plantation houses, the misses, perhaps they had some of their cast off garments that they could, went to the trash and they snagged them to cut up and use to make their quilts. A quilt now, um, generally speaking, is 100% cotton, and there's grades of that as well. There's cotton fabric and there's cotton fabric. Um, where in those days, those people had whatever they found. Could have been burlap sack, could have been a feed sack, which nowadays quilters would like run to get their hands on good feed sack fabrics, good real ones. They're hard to come by anymore. Um, I remember my mother or my grandmother and my grandfather had a chicken farm in Poconos, and the feed always came in those big cotton sacks. And she saved them and made pillowcases. All her pillowcases were made from feed sacks, and they were all cotton. But I think I'm pretty sure that any fabrics that the slaves got their hands on would have been, it might have already been almost threadbare by the time they got their hands on it, because they had to take whatever they could find or was given them. Um, so the chances of quilts lasting from the slaves era, Civil War time to now would be pretty slim. Because again, like I said, they would be heavily used. They'd be laundered, nothing like ivory or dawn. It would have been lye or some other really harsh soap. Um, so that would be, one of the reasons we don't have many to go by.
Do you think that enslaved women made quilts for the plantation owners?
Do I think the women what to plantation owners?
Made quilts for the plantation owners.
Um, I think probably they did. I think they probably did. Yeah. Um, I would think so, because a lot of what again, this is me thinking out loud, but from a lot of what I've read, the ladies of the house, there was the degree of slaves. There was that pecking order, if so to speak. They had people in the house who did their chores, who dressed them, who made, who cooked, who whatever. And then the others were more like the field workers and things like that. So yeah, I would think that they probably did tell a slave at the house, if she was good with needle and thread, that they needed a quilt. I don't know where else they would have really gotten one. Um, I don't know. That's a good one for me to look up. I don't know, but that's a guess.
When you were talking about colors, there's a question about do you think that they used indigo colors?
I do. I do. Yep. And that's another one that was not color fast by any means. Um, but I think that was probably something they could get their hands on, or something close to it, and, and create their dyes. Um, I, there are so many things that boggle my mind. These people work endless hours all day long. Yet in the evenings, middle of the night, whenever it was, they managed to do all these other things that and work their fingers to the bone. I mean, can you imagine using hemp to sew a quilt together with your hands? Would be like raw. I they're incredible. It's incredible.
There was a question about, there was a book, I believe, called The Kitchen House by Catherine Grissom, and it was a quilt that was used to hide valuables within the quilt squares. Was that commonplace?
I have read that. I have read that before, that um back in the day, they would sew things into the quilt, um and take it with them and hope that they weren't discovered, and that was how if they were discovered and they could get away, they didn't have loose things around. Everything was hidden in their quilt. Bearing in mind they had very little to begin with. Um, but it might be a trinket, just a trinket, or something. The man is leaving the plantation, and behind he's leaving his wife and children. Maybe he has a little trinket of hers, or a piece of her hair, or something that's very precious to him, and had it sewn into the quilt. Yeah, I believe that's.
I think it's interesting that being a quilter, some of the patterns you've shown, I've seen many of these patterns where they have made quilts using those patterns, and the people making the quilts probably had no idea the significance of the pattern.
Not at all, I'm sure. I didn't until, maybe 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't, I mean, I've been out of high school for over 50 years. So, but I have a fairly good memory still, and I have no recollection of any sort of in-depth teaching, learning of the Underground Railroad. I believe it was likely mentioned and moved on, like curriculum does, because you got to cover too much. But it's so interesting to me that uh, it has to be in their veins that they have the survival instinct. You know, the atrocities, just getting on ships in Africa and coming here, how they survived that, packed into ships, hundreds of them. And I equate this to the Holocaust as far as unbelievable things in my life that I've read. Um, Separations of families, the fathers dropped off in the Caribbean, the mother dropped off in America, and the children with the mother never to be seen again. Or like the ship's sailors that came from the Caribbean to the New World, and they had a message, a letter of drawings or a trinket or something, and how they found their wife, that this guy's wife, or how, and no way to communicate in writing. It's just amazing to me. It boggles my mind.
Well, and that's when you talk about the quilts, the patterns used as signals when they didn't read or write. It definitely supports the fact that this was all done verbally,
Yeah,
because how would they pass that message along to look for a certain quilt pattern to indicate, a certain thing, like to follow the North Star, or to, if they saw this hanging on a clothesline or on a
yeah,
fence, it meant a certain thing, and it all had to be done verbally. And that's really mind-boggling when you think about it.
yeah. And and I've tried to imagine you're trying to escape. Now, to me, escape is you can't let anybody see you or identify. So your whole time, your mind's consumed with, is somebody looking at me? Am I being safe? Am I this? And now you're looking for a clothesline with a signal on it, or a lit lantern, or an unlit lantern, or whatever it is. You're following the North Star, you're following the geese. But all the time, all these things going through your body and your mind, it had to be, it stymies me. It truly does. It truly does. It's hard to, and the more I read about it, the more questions I have. You know, something pops into my mind like that. How do you stay on the path, take in everything in your environment and surroundings to keep yourself safe while you're still looking for clues and signals? I don't know.
Well, Sharon, we really appreciate your insight on this tonight.
Thanks.
And we think that Sharon loves to do quilting programs. She just told me tonight she wants to do one on the G-Spin quilts, as one of our additional programs coming up. So this is a list of the upcoming programs that we have. And our next one is Murders and Funky Stuff in Schoharie County. Karen Cusinello is one of our favorite presenters, and then I'll be doing one on Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady and Humanitarian. So those are our March programs. Always remember the programs are the second and the fourth, the second Monday of each month. The second program is always Zoom and live, and then the fourth Monday is always just a Zoom only programs. So we have some great programs coming up for the rest of the year. There's 2 programs every month. And if you are enjoying what you see, give us some feedback. There's our email address there. We're doing some great things at the Sharon Historical Society. Not only do we offer tremendous programs throughout the month, but we're doing some great things in person, building a whole new historical village at the property at 236 Main Street. And we're going to be restoring and um, redoing our museum. And so it's some really great things are happening. So Thank you again, Sharon, for joining us. And we,
Thanks for asking me. I enjoyed it.
yeah. So people have asked about this, when the recording will be available, and we will notify everyone when the recording is available, and you'll receive an email on that. So thank you all,
Thanks.
and have a great evening.
Good night.